At the restaurant, the waiter wrote on my receipt, "Don't go home tonight. Trust me." The ink was still wet when I noticed it, bleeding slightly into the paper fiber of the receipt tucked inside the black leather folder. My credit card sat on top, but underneath, scrawled in handwriting that looked rushed and urgent, were 7 words that made my stomach drop. "Don't go home tonight. Trust me." I looked up immediately, scanning the dining room for our waiter, but he'd vanished into the kitchen's swinging doors. The restaurant hummed with Friday evening energy, couples leaning close over candlelight, business dinners winding down at larger tables, the soft clatter of silverware against plates creating a soundtrack of normalcy that suddenly felt deeply wrong. My husband Garrett was checking his phone across the table, his face lit by the blue screen glow, completely oblivious to the message I was holding. We'd been married for 3 years, together for 5, and tonight's dinner at Meridian was supposed to be a celebration of his promotion to senior partner at the law firm. He'd ordered expensive wine, rare steak, laughed at appropriate moments during conversation. Everything had seemed normal until 60 seconds ago when I'd opened this folder and found a stranger's warning written in desperate pen strokes. My hands started shaking hard enough that the receipt trembled, making the words blur. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor loud enough that the couple at the next table glanced over. Garrett looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from distraction to mild annoyance. "Where are you going? We haven't paid yet." His voice carried that edge it got when I did something unexpected in public, when I deviated from the script of how his wife should behave. I held up the receipt folder without showing him what was inside. "Bathroom. I'll be right back." I moved toward the restrooms before he could respond, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy. The hallway leading to the restrooms was narrow and dimly lit, decorated with black and white photographs of the city from decades ago. I pushed through the women's room door and locked myself in a stall, pulling out my phone with trembling fingers. I read the message again, the words unchanged, still urgent, still terrifying. Why would our waiter warn me not to go home? How would he know anything about my life outside this restaurant? I tried to remember details about him, but he'd been professionally invisible the way good waiters are, appearing to take orders and deliver food, disappearing when not needed. I couldn't even remember his face clearly. I heard the bathroom door open and froze, holding my breath like a child hiding from monsters. Footsteps crossed the tile, heels clicking with purpose. Then a stall door closed. Just another patron. I forced myself to breathe normally and think rationally. This could be a mistake. The message meant for someone else, accidentally placed in our folder. Or a prank, some server's idea of a twisted joke. Or I was overreacting to something that had a perfectly innocent explanation I couldn't see because my imagination was spiraling. But the handwriting had looked so urgent, the message so specific. "Don't go home tonight." Not "don't go home late" or "don't drive home drunk." Tonight, as if tonight specifically was dangerous. I pulled up my home security app on my phone, the one Garrett had insisted we install 6 months ago after a break-in 2 blocks over. The cameras showed our living room empty, our bedroom undisturbed, the kitchen dark. Everything looked normal from these frozen angles. I switched to the feed from the front door camera and saw our porch exactly as we'd left it 3 hours ago. The welcome mat centered, the potted plants healthy. No signs of disturbance? Nothing was wrong. Nothing looked threatening. But the message sat heavy in my pocket like a stone, weighing down every rational thought. When I returned to the table, Garrett had already signed the receipt. His signature was bold and certain, the way everything about Garrett was bold and certain. He stood and held out my coat with the solicitous gesture he always made in public, the perfect husband helping his wife. "Ready? I have that brief to review before Monday." His hand touched the small of my back as we walked toward the exit, and I fought the urge to pull away. We passed through the dining room and I searched desperately for our waiter, needing to see his face, to ask what he meant, to understand why he'd written that message. But the staff I saw were all strangers, and the kitchen doors remained closed. The October air outside was cold enough to sting my lungs, autumn in Philadelphia turning sharp and unforgiving as it moved toward winter. Our car was parked 2 blocks away in the garage, and Garrett walked with his usual confident stride, while I tried to formulate words that would convince him we should go anywhere except home. "What if we got a hotel tonight?" I heard myself say. My voice sounded strange, too high and brittle. "Something nice downtown, make a weekend of celebrating your promotion." Garrett stopped walking and turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Why would we do that when we have a perfectly good house?" I scrambled for plausible reasons, my mind racing through excuses that wouldn't sound insane. "I just thought it might be romantic. We haven't done anything spontaneous in a while." Garrett's expression shifted into something that resembled patience but felt more like condescension. "Leah, we just spent $300 on dinner. Adding a hotel room to that is excessive, don't you think? Besides, I need my laptop and my files are at home." He resumed walking toward the garage, and I followed because I didn't know what else to do. The message burned in my pocket, but I couldn't show it to him without sounding paranoid or unstable. We drove home in silence, broken only by sports radio, Garrett listening to analysis of games I didn't care about while I stared out the window watching familiar streets pass. Our neighborhood appeared exactly as it always did on Friday nights. Houses lit from within, showing families eating late dinners or watching television, A few teenagers clustered on a corner laughing about something. Normal life happening all around us while I carried a warning I didn't understand from someone I couldn't identify. When Garrett pulled into our driveway and killed the engine, I sat frozen in my seat, unable to make myself open the car door. "Are you coming or are you going to sleep in the car?" Garrett's tone was joking but impatient, his keys already in hand. I forced myself to move, to open the door, to walk up the front steps while every instinct screamed to run in the opposite direction. Garrett unlocked the door and pushed it open, reaching inside to flip the light switch. Warm light flooded our entryway, illuminating the same furniture we'd arranged months ago, the same artwork on the walls, the same coat hooks where Garrett was already hanging his jacket. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was different. But I stood on the threshold, unable to cross it. "Leah, what is wrong with you tonight?" Garrett's voice carried genuine confusion, now mixed with irritation. "You've been acting strange since we left the restaurant." I couldn't explain it to him without showing him the receipt, and showing him the receipt meant admitting I'd taken seriously a random message from a stranger. It meant looking irrational and paranoid, proving again that I couldn't be trusted to interpret reality correctly. Garrett had spent 3 years subtly establishing that narrative, painting me as the emotional one, the overreactive one, the one who needed his steady logic to navigate the world. This would be more evidence for his case. I stepped inside, and the moment my foot crossed the threshold, the lights went out. Total darkness swallowed the house so completely, I couldn't see Garrett standing 3 feet away. My breath caught in my throat, and I reached instinctively for the wall, for anything solid. "Circuit breaker probably tripped," Garrett said, his voice unnaturally calm. "Wait here, I'll check the basement." I heard him move through the darkness with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of this space. His footsteps receded toward the basement door, and I stood alone in the entryway, my eyes slowly adjusting enough to make out shapes but not details. Then I heard it, a sound from upstairs, subtle but distinct, the creak of a floorboard bearing weight, the specific groan our hallway made when someone walked from the bedroom toward the stairs. Someone was in our house. Someone had been waiting for us in the dark. My entire body went rigid with terror, so profound I couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't do anything except stand there while my mind raced through impossible conclusions. The waiter had known. Somehow he had known someone would be here, waiting in our house, and he'd tried to warn me. "Garrett," I whispered, but my voice came out too quiet to carry. I tried again, louder. "Garrett, someone's upstairs." No response from the basement. The floorboard creaked again, closer now, someone moving toward the stairs with careful, deliberate steps. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The screen's glow felt like a searchlight in the darkness, blinding me to everything beyond its radius. I pulled up 911 and my thumb hovered over the call button. What would I say? Someone's in my house, but I don't actually know that for certain. I just heard a floorboard creak and got a weird note from a waiter. The basement door opened, and Garrett's voice called up, "The main breaker is fine. Must be a power outage on the whole block." His flashlight beam swept through the darkness as he climbed the stairs. "I'll call the electric company." His calm was infuriating and reassuring in equal measure. Maybe I'd imagined the footsteps. Maybe old houses just made sounds and my paranoia had transformed normal creaks into intruders. But then Garrett's flashlight caught something on the stairs and he stopped moving. "What the hell is that?" I moved closer and saw what had frozen him. Muddy footprints on our carpet, leading up the stairs, fresh enough that the mud was still wet and dark. Someone had walked through our house with dirty shoes, tracking soil up toward our bedroom. Garrett's entire demeanor changed in an instant, his body going tense and alert. "Get outside," he said quietly. "Call 911. Now." I didn't argue. I turned and ran for the front door, yanking it open and stumbling onto the porch while pulling up my phone again. This time I hit call without hesitation, my voice shaking as I told the dispatcher someone had broken into our house. The police arrived within 6 minutes, 2 patrol cars pulling up with lights flashing but no sirens. 4 officers entered our house with weapons drawn, while Garrett and I waited on the front lawn, watching neighbors emerge onto their porches to see what was happening. The October cold bit through my dress, but I barely felt it, too focused on the lit windows of our house, as officers moved through rooms with flashlights, clearing each space. One officer came out after 10 minutes and approached us with a careful expression. "The house is empty now," he said, "but someone was definitely here. Your bedroom's been ransacked." Ransacked. The word hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been in our bedroom, touching our things, going through our private space while we sat at dinner celebrating Garrett's promotion. The officer continued talking about broken window in the back, about how they'd need us to walk through and inventory what was missing, about dusting for fingerprints. But I was only half listening because I was remembering the waiter's message, the warning I'd dismissed as paranoia until muddy footprints proved it real. Someone had known this would happen. The waiter had known. "Did you notice anything unusual before you left for dinner?" the officer asked. "Any suspicious vehicles in the neighborhood? Anyone who seemed to be watching your house?" Garrett shook his head, but I found myself speaking before I could think better of it. "I got a warning," I said, pulling the crumpled receipt from my pocket. "At the restaurant. Our waiter wrote this on our bill." I handed it to the officer and watched his expression shift as he read it. He looked up at me with new intensity. "Which restaurant?" he asked. Meridian, about 10 blocks from here. The officer made notes and asked for more details about the waiter, but I couldn't provide much beyond a vague description that probably fit half the servers in the city. We were allowed back inside after an hour, escorted by officers who wanted us to check for missing items. Our bedroom looked like a tornado had torn through it. Drawers yanked open and emptied. Closet contents scattered across the floor. Mattress pulled away from the headboard. Garrett's jewelry box was empty. My grandmother's pearls gone. The cash we kept in the nightstand drawer missing. But as I looked at the destruction, something felt wrong beyond the obvious violation. This wasn't the efficient work of a thief grabbing valuables and leaving. This was someone searching for something specific, pulling apart everything methodically, leaving chaos in their wake. Is anything else missing besides jewelry and cash? The officer asked. We walked through the rest of the house checking, but nothing downstairs appeared touched. Television still mounted on the wall, laptop still on the desk, expensive kitchen appliances untouched. Whoever had broken in had focused entirely on our bedroom, specifically on places where people hide important things. I thought about Garrett's work files, his position at the law firm, the high-profile cases he'd mentioned over dinner. Could this be related to your work? I asked him. Someone looking for information about a case? Garrett's face went carefully blank, the expression he got when he was calculating how much truth to reveal. I handle confidential information, but nothing someone would break into our house for. This was just a random burglary. His dismissal felt too quick, too certain. The officer seemed to agree because he asked, "What kind of law do you practice?" Garrett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Corporate litigation mostly. Very boring stuff, trust me. But his tone had shifted into the one he used in court, smooth and persuasive and hiding something underneath. The officers left around midnight with promises to investigate and recommendations to change our locks and upgrade our security. Garrett called a 24-hour locksmith who arrived at 1 a.m. and spent an hour installing new deadbolts. I sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, unable to stop shaking, unable to stop thinking about the waiter who'd somehow known this would happen. How had he known? Was he involved in the break-in, part of some elaborate scheme? Or had he genuinely tried to protect me from something he'd overheard or witnessed? The questions multiplied faster than possible answers. When the locksmith finally left and we were alone again in our violated house, Garrett poured himself a scotch and sat in the chair across from me. "We should try to get some sleep," he said, but neither of us moved. The house felt contaminated now, unsafe even with new locks. Every shadow looked threatening, every sound suspicious. "I want to find that waiter," I said. "I want to know how he knew about the break-in." Garrett took a long drink before responding. He probably didn't know anything. Maybe he saw someone suspicious near our car, put two and two together, made a lucky guess. Don't read too much into it. But I was reading everything into it because the alternative was believing in impossible coincidences. I pulled out my phone and searched for Meridian's website, finding their phone number and calling despite the late hour. The line rang 5 times before someone answered, a tired male voice saying they were closed. "I need information about one of your servers," I said quickly before he could hang up. "I was there tonight and something happened. Something connected to a message he wrote on my receipt. I need to talk to him." There was a long pause. "Call back during business hours and ask for the manager," the voice said, and disconnected. I tried finding Meridian's staff on social media, searching through tagged photos and check-ins, but the restaurant's accounts were professionally managed with no individual server profiles visible. Frustrated and exhausted, I finally gave up and went upstairs to face our destroyed bedroom. Garrett had already fallen asleep on the couch, either from scotch or stress, and I was grateful not to have to share a bed with him in this violated space. I cleared enough debris to create a path to the closet, found clean sheets, and remade the bed with mechanical movements. Then I lay down in the darkness and stared at the ceiling, unable to close my eyes, unable to stop my mind from racing. Morning came gray and cold, Sunday light filtering through curtains that someone had touched with invasive hands. I'd slept maybe 2 hours in fragments, jerking awake at every sound, convinced someone was still in the house. Garrett woke around 8 and immediately started making phone calls, mobilizing his lawyer brain to handle the practical aftermath. Insurance company, security system upgrades, police follow-up. He moved through the checklist with impressive efficiency while I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee that tasted like ashes, the receipt with its warning message spread out in front of me. "I'm going to the restaurant," I announced when Garrett paused between calls. He looked at me with that expression that said I was being irrational again. "They're not even open this early. And what exactly do you think you'll accomplish?" Everything about his tone suggested I was wasting time on pointless dramatics when there were real problems to solve. But I needed answers more than I needed his approval. "I'll wait until they open. I need to understand how that waiter knew." Garrett sighed the way he did when indulging a child's unreasonable request. "Fine. I'll be here dealing with the actual important things." I drove to Meridian at 10:30. The Sunday morning streets quiet, except for people walking dogs and buying newspapers. The restaurant looked different in daylight, less romantic and more tired, its elegant facade showing wear at the edges. A sign on the door said they opened at 11 for brunch, so I sat in my car and waited, watching staff arrive and unlock doors, prep for the day's service. At 11:05, I walked in and asked the hostess if I could speak with the manager. She made me wait while she fetched someone, and eventually a woman in her 50s appeared, introducing herself as Diana Volkov, owner and general manager. I showed her the receipt and explained what happened, watching her expression shift from polite confusion to genuine concern as I described the break-in and the waiter's warning. "I need to know which server wrote this," I said. "I need to understand how he knew." Diana studied the receipt for a long moment, her face troubled. "I need to check our records from Friday night. Can you describe the waiter?" I tried, offering details that felt embarrassingly vague. Tall, maybe, dark hair, clean-shaven, nothing distinctive. Diana disappeared into the back and returned 10 minutes later with a printout showing our table assignment. "Your server Friday night was Kevin Lattimore," she said. "He's worked here for 2 years. Reliable kid, never any problems. But he didn't come in for his shift last night. Didn't call, didn't answer when we tried reaching him. That's completely out of character." Something cold settled in my stomach. "Do you have an address for him? A phone number?" Diana hesitated, clearly weighing privacy concerns against the seriousness of the situation. "I can try calling him again, but I can't give out personal information." She pulled out her phone and dialed while I waited, my heart hammering. The call went to voicemail and Diana left a message asking Kevin to call back urgently. She hung up and looked at me with worry deepening the lines around her eyes. If something happened to Kevin because of something he saw here, she didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung between us. If Kevin had witnessed someone planning the break-in and tried to warn me, he might be in danger. "I need to file a police report," I said. "About Kevin missing. About the connection to my break-in." Diana nodded and called the police herself, explaining the situation to a dispatcher. Within an hour, 2 detectives arrived at the restaurant, a woman named Detective Laura Kim and her partner, Detective James Flores. They took statements from both Diana and me, examining the receipt with its warning message like it was evidence in a crime far more serious than simple burglary. Detective Kim asked detailed questions about Kevin's behavior Friday night, whether he'd seemed nervous or distracted. I struggled to remember anything beyond the basics of his service. "We'll need to see your security footage from Friday evening," Detective Flores said to Diana. "Everything from when this couple arrived until they left." Diana led them to the office and pulled up digital files while I stood in the doorway watching. The footage showed our table from a high corner angle, Garrett and me talking over wine, Kevin approaching to take orders and deliver food. Everything looked normal until the moment Kevin dropped off our check. He'd lingered slightly, looking around the dining room before quickly writing something on the receipt and sliding it into the folder. The motion was subtle, practiced, over in seconds. But what caught everyone's attention was what happened next. The camera showed Kevin walking toward the kitchen, then suddenly changing direction and moving toward the restaurant's front windows. He stood there for several seconds, looking out at the street with his body language radiating tension. Then he pulled out his phone, typed something, and hurried toward the back of the restaurant. "Can you show us the exterior camera?" Detective Kim asked. Diana pulled up a different feed showing the street in front of Meridian. The timestamp matched the moment Kevin had been looking out the window, and the footage revealed what he'd seen. A black SUV parked across the street with its engine running, 2 figures visible in the front seats. The angle didn't capture license plates or faces clearly, but the vehicle's position gave it a clear view of the restaurant's entrance. "They were waiting for us," I said, my voice barely a whisper, watching to see when we left. Detective Flores rewound the footage and enhanced it as much as the system allowed, but the faces remained indistinct. What was clear was that someone had been conducting surveillance on the restaurant, specifically on our table. Kevin must have noticed them and recognized the threat, prompting his warning. But how had he known they were connected to me? How had he known not just that something suspicious was happening, but that I specifically was in danger? Detective Kim made notes and requested copies of all footage from Friday evening. She turned to me with the intense focus of someone assembling a puzzle from scattered pieces. "Has anyone been following you recently? Any threats? Any unusual contact? Anyone showing too much interest in your routine?" I started to shake my head, then stopped. Over the past few weeks, I'd noticed small things. The same car on my street multiple times, a figure I'd seen outside my office building twice, a stranger at the grocery store who'd seemed to be watching me. At the time, I'd dismissed each incident as coincidence or paranoia, the byproduct of living in a city where you saw the same people repeatedly by chance. But strung together in light of last night's break-in, the pattern looked different. "Maybe," I admitted. Small things that seemed like nothing individually. I described what I'd noticed, and Detective Kim's expression grew more serious with each detail. "What about your husband? Has he mentioned anything unusual? Any problems at work? Any concerning clients?" I thought about Garrett's careful blankness when asked about his cases, his dismissal of any connection between his work and the break-in. He said his cases were boring corporate stuff, nothing worth breaking into our house for. Detective Kim and Flores exchanged a look that suggested they didn't find that explanation satisfying. "We'll need to speak with him," Detective Flores said. "And we're going to need details about his current cases, client lists, anything that might explain who would target your home." The investigation expanded rapidly from there. Detectives went to my house to interview Garrett, who initially maintained his position that the break-in was random and unconnected to his work. But when pressed, when shown the surveillance footage of the SUV watching us at dinner, his story started to fracture. He admitted he'd been working on a case involving a pharmaceutical company accused of hiding trial data that linked their drug to patient deaths. The case was worth hundreds of millions in potential damages, and the company was fighting viciously to prevent it from going to trial. Garrett had been deposing key witnesses and had recently obtained documents that the company had tried to keep sealed. "Where are those documents now?" Detective Kim asked. Garrett's face went pale. "At my office, in a safe. The only copies are digital and encrypted on my work laptop, which I keep at the firm's office." But Detective Flores was already shaking his head, pulling up something on his phone. "Your office was broken into last night, around 3 a.m., after you reported your home burglary. They bypassed security, opened your safe, took your laptop and files." The news hit Garrett like a physical blow. He sat down heavily on our couch, all his certainty and control evaporating. "That case," he said quietly, "it was supposed to go to trial next month. Without those documents, without the evidence I'd compiled, the plaintiffs have no case. Families who lost people to that drug won't get justice." The puzzle pieces were assembling into a picture far larger and darker than a simple burglary. Someone had been surveilling us, learning our routines, waiting for the right moment to steal evidence that could destroy a pharmaceutical company. They'd broken into our house first as either a distraction or an initial attempt to find the documents, then moved on to Garrett's office when that failed. Kevin Lattimore had somehow figured out what was happening and tried to warn me, a warning I'd barely heeded in time. And now Kevin was missing, potentially because the same people who'd ransacked our home had identified him as a witness. Detective Kim's phone rang, and she stepped away to take the call, speaking in low, urgent tones. When she returned, her expression was grim. "Kevin Lattimore's car was found abandoned in a parking garage downtown. There's blood on the driver's seat." The words hit me like ice water. Kevin had tried to help me, and now he was missing and bleeding, disappeared by people who'd already shown they'd break into homes and offices to get what they wanted. This was my fault, I thought irrationally. If I'd taken his warning more seriously, if I'd called the police from the restaurant, if I'd made different choices, maybe Kevin would be safe. "This is now a missing persons investigation," Detective Flores said. "Possibly kidnapping or worse. We need everything you can remember about Friday night, every detail about Kevin's behavior, anything he might have said or done that indicated how he knew about the surveillance." I walked them through the evening again, trying to resurrect moments I'd barely paid attention to at the time. Kevin had been professional and unobtrusive, appearing when needed and disappearing when not. But thinking harder, I remembered one odd moment. When he'd delivered our entrees, he'd knocked over a water glass at the table next to ours, apologizing profusely while cleaning it up. The couple at that table had been annoyed but dismissive. I'd thought nothing of it at the time, just a server having a clumsy moment. "What if that wasn't an accident?" I said slowly. "What if Kevin knocked over that water on purpose to get close to that table, to hear what they were saying?" Detective Kim pulled up the security footage again, finding the timestamp of the water glass incident. The footage showed exactly what I'd described. Kevin delivering food to our table, then somehow fumbling a glass at the adjacent table. But more importantly, it showed who was sitting there. The angle captured their faces clearly. A man in his 50s and a younger woman, both dressed in business attire, both leaning close in conversation that looked intense. Detective Kim screenshot their faces and ran them through facial recognition software, getting hits within minutes. The man was Douglas Ferriman, chief legal counsel for Apex Pharma, the company Garrett was suing. The woman was Natalie Cross, a private investigator who'd been sued 3 times for illegal surveillance and harassment. They'd been sitting one table away from us Friday night, close enough to overhear our conversation, close enough for Kevin to have heard them discussing their plans when he approached their table. Kevin hadn't randomly discovered a threat to me. He'd overheard corporate operatives literally plotting against my husband while they surveilled us at dinner, planning the break-ins that would happen hours later. And when he'd tried to warn me, when he'd written that note, he'd made himself a target. The investigation moved with frightening speed once police understood the stakes. Apex Pharma's offices were raided, computers seized, executives questioned. Douglas Ferriman and Natalie Cross were arrested on charges ranging from burglary to corporate espionage. But Kevin Lattimore remained missing, and with each passing hour, the likelihood of finding him alive decreased. The media picked up the story, turning it into a scandal about corporate malfeasance and the lengths companies would go to suppress evidence. Garrett became a reluctant hero, the lawyer whose house was ransacked in retaliation for standing up to powerful interests. I became a footnote, the wife who'd received a cryptic warning from a waiter whose fate remained unknown. 3 days after Kevin disappeared, a hiker found him in a state park 30 miles outside the city. He was alive but badly beaten, left tied to a tree in a remote area where he might never have been found if not for chance. The people who'd taken him had wanted information about what he'd overheard, about what he'd told me, about whether he'd shared details with anyone else. When Kevin insisted he'd only written a vague warning on a receipt, they'd beaten him harder, convinced he was lying. Eventually, they'd decided he was telling the truth, and that killing him would create more problems than it solved. So they dumped him in the woods and hoped he'd die of exposure before anyone found him. Kevin survived, barely, and his testimony along with the evidence seized from Apex Pharma buried the company and everyone involved in the conspiracy. Douglas Fairman and Natalie Cross faced criminal charges. Two executives who'd ordered the break-ins were arrested. The pharmaceutical company's stock collapsed, and the civil case Garrett had been building proceeded with overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. Families who'd lost loved ones to the drug got their day in court and their compensation. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. But the cost had been nearly unbearable, paid primarily by a restaurant server who'd tried to do the right thing for a stranger. I visited Kevin in the hospital the day after they found him, bringing flowers and an apology that felt completely inadequate. He was wrapped in bandages, face swollen and purple, but he was alive and conscious. And when he saw me, his expression held no anger, only relief. "You listened," he said through split lips. "You didn't go home when I told you not to. You're okay." The fact that he was grateful I'd heeded his warning, despite everything that warning had cost him, broke something inside me. I started crying and couldn't stop, all the fear and guilt and horror of the past 3 days pouring out in his hospital room while he tried to comfort me from his hospital bed. "I was trying to be brave," Kevin said when I'd composed myself enough to listen. "I heard them planning it, heard them talking about timing it for when you'd be at dinner, when the house would be empty. I knew I should call the police, but I was scared they'd see me on the phone, scared they'd hurt me or hurt you if I made it obvious I'd overheard. So I just wrote that note and hoped you'd take it seriously enough to avoid danger." His bravery had been imperfect and terrified and had nearly gotten him killed, but it had also prevented something potentially far worse. If Garrett and I had walked into that house while the break-in was happening, if we'd confronted intruders searching for sensitive documents, the violence could have escalated beyond burglary. The media wanted to interview Kevin, to make him into a hero story about ordinary people standing up to corporate corruption. He refused every request, wanting only to return to his quiet life serving food and studying for his nursing degree, which I learned he'd been pursuing at community college between restaurant shifts. I helped him with medical bills that his restaurant insurance didn't cover, a small gesture that felt simultaneously necessary and insufficient. Garrett offered to give him a reward from the settlement money once the case concluded, but Kevin declined that too, saying he'd only done what anyone should do when they see someone in danger. But most people wouldn't have done what Kevin did. Most people would have convinced themselves it wasn't their business, that they'd misheard, that getting involved was too risky. Kevin had acted despite fear, despite uncertainty, despite the very real danger that proved itself when they found him beaten and tied to a tree. He'd trusted his instincts and tried to protect a stranger, and that simple act of courage had cascaded into consequences none of us could have predicted. The pharmaceutical company fell, families got justice, criminals faced charges, and all of it traced back to 7 words scrawled on a dinner receipt by a scared young man who couldn't stay silent when he overheard evil being planned. 6 months later, I filed for divorce from Garrett. The break-in and everything that followed had revealed fault lines in our marriage I'd been ignoring for years. His dismissiveness when I'd wanted to heed Kevin's warning, his immediate assumption that I was being irrational, his prioritization of his work and image over my fear and safety, all of it crystallized into understanding that I was married to someone who saw me as an accessory to his life rather than a full person with valid instincts. The night of the break-in had shown me I couldn't trust him to believe me when I said something was wrong, and I couldn't build a life with someone who'd always assume I was overreacting until evidence proved otherwise. Garrett fought the divorce initially, confused by my reasoning, unable to understand how his response to one crisis could justify ending our marriage. But his confusion was the point. He genuinely didn't see what he'd done wrong, couldn't recognize that dismissing my fear and the warning that validated it revealed something fundamental about how he viewed me. Eventually, he agreed to the divorce, probably calculating that prolonging the fight would damage his professional reputation more than quietly ending things. We divided assets and went our separate ways, both of us moving out of the house that would never feel safe again, regardless of new locks and security systems. Kevin completed his nursing degree and got a job at the same hospital where he'd recovered from his injuries. We stayed in touch through occasional texts and coffee meetings, a friendship born from trauma but sustained by genuine mutual respect. He told me once that the experience had made him more certain of his choice to become a nurse, that seeing how quickly life could become dangerous made him want to spend his career helping people through their moments of crisis. I told him he'd already saved at least one life, mine, possibly Garrett's too, definitely his own by fighting through days tied to a tree until someone found him. He shrugged it off with the humility that seemed fundamental to who he was, saying he'd just written a note and hoped for the best. But that note had been everything. 7 words scrawled in desperate urgency by someone who'd overheard danger and refused to ignore it, who'd acted despite fear, who'd trusted that a stranger would take his warning seriously enough to avoid catastrophe. "Don't go home tonight. Trust me." I'd heeded those words just barely enough to survive, to see the muddy footprints before walking deeper into violation, to call police before confronting intruders. The warning hadn't prevented the break-ins or the violence that followed, but it had given me those crucial minutes of awareness that meant the difference between being a victim and being a survivor. 5 years later, I still carry that receipt in my wallet, the ink faded but the message still legible, a reminder that sometimes salvation comes from unexpected sources, delivered by strangers brave enough to scrawl warnings on dinner bills when they overhear evil being planned.